Hi there. Hope everyone's doing well. Looking forward to seeing at least some of you in class this week. As I've just been saying on the Teams page, this week's going to be a little bit different. I'm going to have to kind of assign you work to start with, and because of me struggling to do a live lesson with you for the next little while, I thought I would do a video of this next key area that you're doing for this week. So although it's not ideal, at least you can still go back, watch through this, and hopefully you'll find it useful as well as just not just reading through a PowerPoint. So guys, very simply, key area 7, components of biodiversity. We're almost at the end of the higher topic, or the higher course in general even. This is a really short key area. There's only a few things you need to know about it. I know we're not really having as much of a discussion as we normally would, but I'll assign some work for you and hopefully top you up later on in the week as well. So effectively, what we're going to take a look at in this lesson, or in this short video, is we're going to look at the 3 components of biodiversity. So what makes up biodiversity? We're going to have a look at what they actually are, what they do, what they actually mean, and some examples of them. And we're going to be taking a bit of a look in terms of genetic diversity and species richness. We'll explain what that actually means just in a couple of minutes. So just to start off with, in terms of what is an ecosystem in general, before we deep dive into the components of it, you may remember from National 5 that an ecosystem is made up of all the organisms that live in a habitat. So remember, a community would be all the different organisms. A population would be members of the one species, for example. So a community is all the living organisms in a habitat, but also how they interact with non-living components. So it could be the light, the temperature, the humidity, okay, sort of the waterways that go through this habitat. All of them work together into this one entity, which we term an ecosystem. So in terms of the components of biodiversity, which really kind of show how much life is really available in these ecosystems, there are 3 things we're going to look at. They're fairly self-explanatory. First of all, there's genetic diversity, which is the number and the frequency of alleles which are within a population. So it's the genetic mix of a population, if you think of it that way. If you compare it to when you've been talking about inbreeding, for example, there's inbred populations are not diverse genetically. There's not a mix of genetics. There's not that large pool of genes that we talk about. So that's the measure of the genetic diversity of a population. In terms of species diversity, though, that is both the number of different species in an ecosystem, but also the proportion of them. So you may have a lot of different species in an ecosystem, but there's a couple of species that make up most of the ecosystem. Okay, and that's going to be a little difference we're going to look at just in a minute. And finally, there is ecosystem diversity. And the diversity of ecosystems is basically the number of distinct individual ecosystems within a defined area. And we'll look at some comparisons of this as well. So in terms of this genetic diversity, we've spoke quite a lot in terms of it's always good to have a mix of genes. You need to have a lot of different alleles, a lot of different genes available, and it gives you this useful mix. So the number and frequency of all alleles within a population is genetic diversity. However, if there's a species and there's one population, for example, dies out from that species, that can have a knock-on impact onto the genetic diversity of that species. If you lose certain populations of your species, you lose genetics, you lose a mix of alleles, and that may actually limit your ability to adapt to changing conditions. If you go back and think of the process of, say, speciation and evolution, for example, if you were to lose out the genes of a population and the event was to happen that perhaps you could not adapt to, through that loss of genetic diversity, that's going to be a bad thing for you. So for example, in this graphic here, if we have a look at all of these different coloured circles, signifying different alleles, different genes, we're seeing a very genetically diverse population here. What could happen is there could be some sort of event that wipes out a population or some populations of the species, and instead you're left with this species that, although still exists, has much more reduced genetic diversity, and that could be a harmful thing to them potentially in the future. A good example of this would be the Irish potato famine, if you're aware of it at all. This is a memorial to it. The idea of the Irish potato famine, where the main crop in Ireland, potatoes, was affected severely by potato blight, so a crop disease that we may have mentioned earlier on. Because the crops were so low in their genetic diversity, because effectively you had fields and fields all over the country which are really just clones of each other, clones of the same potato crop, it meant that they did not have the mix of genes which could have fended off a pathogen coming across. So, for example, blight could have affected some fields with poor genes, but there may have been other potato fields with a stronger mix of genes which wouldn't have been affected by the blight. Because there was a lack of genetic diversity across the potato crops in general, it meant that the entire potato crop actually just totally failed, which caused mass starvation, mass deaths, and emigration. So a huge part in Irish history, really just down to genetic diversity of a crop. So if a population, for example, dies out in a species, then you lose these alleles, and if you ever lose out or decrease that genetic diversity, it can have a real knock-on impact on your ability to survive a change in conditions, for example. The next part is a bit more straightforward, species diversity. So there's two kind of points to this. Species diversity is the number of different species in an ecosystem, which we refer to as species richness. And it's also the proportion, so how much is taken up by each species, which we call relative abundance. So, for example, here you can see in the graphic, both Community 1 and Community 2, if we imagine they are two different ecosystems, we can see there's the same species richness because they both have 4 different species of tree. So if we're just looking at the number of different species as species richness, they both have 4, so they're both the same. However, you can tell that in Community 2, the majority of this ecosystem is being taken up, or 70% is taken up by this type of tree here, this kind of lighter green pointer version, compared to in Community 1, where it's all nice and even. So they have the same number, the same species richness in Community 1 and Community 2. However, there is different relative abundance, and there's a larger proportion, there's larger relative abundance of this tree in Community 2. Then what would happen is if you have a community or an ecosystem with a dominant species, so for example Community 2, it means that there's a lower species diversity in general than the one with the same species richness, but no particularly dominant species. So again, it's a measure of both the number of species in an ecosystem, but also the proportion of them as well. You don't want one species to just be totally dominant and take over most of the ecosystem. It's not particularly species diverse. Now, the reason for this is if we look at food webs, which you may remember from National 5. If you look at high species diversity, then what would happen is you would have a stable ecosystem, which would have complex food webs. So you can see this food web here. My head hurts just even looking at it, but you can tell there's a lot of different interactions between these different organisms. It's very complex, but in terms of being stable, if you were to remove one or two or several species from this food web, it's really not going to have a catastrophic effect on the ecosystem because there are so many other interactions going on. So for example, if this seal was to lose, just trying to look at this, if it was to lose this fish, for example, there's still plenty of other things this seal could eat. Okay, although it's a negative effect, it's not going to have a massive effect. However, if you have an area with a low species diversity, you have this really simple food web. So you can see straight away the difference is quite clear. This would be more of an unstable ecosystem, purely because the removal of one or a couple of species could actually cause the total failure of this ecosystem. It could cause many species to die out because all the members are closely interlinked. So again, examples here, if you had this owl, okay, not a particularly fair example, but if this grasshopper was to die out, the birds and owls are going to be quite badly affected. I mean, there are some other things it could eat, to be entirely fair, but it's going to have a huge impact. However, in here, you would almost not notice. It's very complex, there's more interactions, and therefore you have a more stable ecosystem with high species diversity. And finally, the last one for you, which is very straightforward, is ecosystem diversity. And what this is the number of different distinct or individual ecosystems within a defined area. So if you have a region that contains a wide variety of different ecosystems, you're going to end up with a greater species diversity than an area with only a few or a lower ecosystem diversity. The reason for that is these different ecosystems provide different habitats. So for example, we have a fairly tropical rainforest here, we have woodland, we have forest, we have a lot of lower plantation, we have water, we have streams. You're more likely to have very mountainous areas, still with a good climate. You can have a lot of different, coastal, dry, whatever, a lot of different ecosystems within this area. Because of that, you have loads and loads of different habitats that loads of different species can thrive in. However, if you compare that to the tundra, for example, you just have one big expanse of nothingness. You are going to have species that live there and species that can survive there quite successfully, but you're not going to have anywhere near the species diversity as a greater ecosystem diversity area. So hopefully that bit kind of makes sense to you. Okay, if you have more ecosystems, you're going to have a greater species diversity. If you have a very low ecosystem diversity, then you're going to have a low species diversity as well. Apologies for saying diversity so many times. I'm confusing myself. So that's all you need for key area 7. Like I said, this is very, very brief. It's like some of the other shorter key areas we've done. Just make sure that you know that the components of biodiversity are genetic diversity, species diversity, and ecosystem diversity. You need to know what genetic diversity actually is made up of, and it'd be helpful if you knew the knock-on impact of losing alleles or losing a population, what happens to genetic diversity there. In terms of species diversity, I want you to be aware of it being the number of different species, species richness, but also that relative abundance, that proportion of the species in the ecosystem. And finally, that ecosystem diversity is fairly straightforward, but just the number of distinct ecosystems within a defined area. Remember, if you have a large diversity of ecosystems, you'll have a high species richness, and conversely, it's the same as well. So thanks so much for listening, folks. I hope you found the video useful. I just wanted to have something else for you to use along with the PowerPoint and the booklet. Hopefully I'll see some of you in school this week. Obviously, if not, I'll be seeing you in the next couple of weeks, and really look forward to seeing you and finding out how you're getting on and what you want to be looking over. For those of you who are doing work online though, you can be going through this, you can maybe add to your notes in your booklet if you feel you need to, and there'll be some questions and assignments going out to you. As I said, I hope to add to this later on in the week as well, to try and keep you a bit busier as well. But I hope everything's going well, and hope whatever lessons you've had in school are going well as well, and we'll finish off with higher very soon, guys. Okay, thanks so much for listening to this, and I'll speak to you really soon.